Afternoon, everybody. We'll be starting the webinar in 1 or 2 minutes. Just going to let a few more attendees join. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our latest Sibylline briefing. Today, our topic is the US-China trade deal. Is it a fragile truce or a framework potentially for rapprochement? Very lucky to be joined by my colleagues, Thor Hidalgo Solar, North America Associate Analyst, and Asia Pacific Principal Analyst Jonah Kaplan today, who'll be sharing their thoughts. I'll be hosting. I'm Aidan Mordecai, Lead Analyst, Asia Pacific Desk for Sibylline. And again, big welcome to everyone who's joined today. A few housekeeping notes before we start. This webinar will be held in the Chatham House rules, so please take that into account when using information that you might hear. Also, the briefing part will take about half an hour, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So please do use the Zoom Q&A box to put in any questions that you may have there for our panelists, and we'll try to get as many as possible when we start. So quick intro to where we are. Of course, trade tensions spiked in when Donald Trump took office in Washington. We had significant increase in tariffs across the world, but particularly on China. And then we had responses from China. And then at the end of October, we had an agreement between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping in Seoul over potential truce, or a seeming truce. And that's what we're going to go in today and look forward to what that might mean for the trading relationship going forward, and how stable is this truce really. So I'll first going to pass it on to Athul, and she's going to go into exactly what was agreed at the end of October.
Great, thank you, Aiden, and hi, everybody. So to kick us off with a brief overview of the deal effective as of November 10th includes some of the provisions that we have highlighted here. So there are 6 main areas that we thought were worth highlighting, the first of which includes the halting of the flow of fentanyl precursors. So following the meeting, the U.S. announced plans to create a bilateral working group with China to address the flow of fentanyl precursors. Both countries have used this tool in the past, and it remains kind of unclear what aspects of this new arrangement will be different than in the past, especially as Trump has previously mentioned that tariffs would remain on China until they saw tangible results on reductions. And so that is something to be looking forward and keeping an eye on for the coming months. The second is the mutual reduction and suspension in tariffs and shipping fees. So the effective rate of tariffs on China is 47.6%. So these tariffs, especially just focusing on the tariffs implemented on the second Trump administration, they are 10% from reciprocal tariffs, the Liberation Day tariffs, and the halved 20% tariffs related to fentanyl precursors are now 10%. And then the rate of tariffs on the US is of 10% reciprocal rates, as well as both countries agreeing to roll back increased docking fees that were announced in mid-October, October 14th. The third is the suspension of export controls, especially related to rare earth elements. So the rollback of these new export controls announced in the previous weeks that came in waves are significant, considering Chinese dominance over reserves and production of these elements, as well as critical minerals that are used in defense, automotive, and semiconductor industries. Then kind of looking more into the realm of national security, China will terminate its investigations targeting U.S. companies in the chip sector, as well as the Chinese market opening up to U.S. soybeans and other agricultural exports. Something that I think is interesting to note in this point in particular for domestically in the U.S. is that although perhaps not the most impactful part of the deal related to kind of numerical gains, this was a very politically contentious issue internally within U.S. politics, and I'll get into a little bit of that more later on in the presentation. And then just finally, the sixth point is the U.S. Suspension of the rule that expanded the number of Chinese firms restricted from accessing advanced technology. And so that was also under the scope of kind of national security aims within the United States. And to that, I will pass it along to Jonah to deep dive into the impact in China.
Sure. US President Donald Trump is a self-proclaimed poker aficionado who famously berated Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office, "You don't have the cards." Now, in Chinese President Xi Jinping, Trump has found his match. China has cards and it's willing to use them. Primarily, this is its rare earth exports. It seems that the US was almost caught unawares to the extent that China has leverage to use rare earth or exports. I mean, China is responsible for 70% of rare earth ore extraction, 90% of its production, and these rare earths are used in refrigerators, electric cars, jet engines across the economy. So there's a lot more talk about that. So China is showed that it could stand up to Trump, stand up to the threats. There's a phrase going around in the West that's quite popular in China, which is "taco." Trump always chickens out. There is a belief that China got some significant wins in these negotiations, particularly around the US dropping its port fees for port calls, the US suspending its tariffs, and frankly that China didn't have to give away too much in order to get America to back down. Nathan, if you could go to the next slide, please. So where are we now in China? What's going to happen over the coming year? Well, the big news in China in 2026 that our APAC team at Sibylline is going to be closely looking at is the 15th five-year plan. Once every 5 years, China's economy is still very top-down, state-led economic model. The five-year plan is distributed to local officials across the country, read very carefully, and sets the direction for policy. We've had some indicators of some of the details of what is going to be in the five-year plan, but it will only be released fully in March. The main focus of the five-year plan, and it's pretty similar to what the previous plan was, is to build self-sufficiency. Now, this is a term that's often going around in China, but what it essentially means, in short, is to reduce China's reliance on other countries, particularly the US and the EU, but also make other countries more reliant on Chinese manufactured goods. So it's essentially a rewiring of global trade. And Trump has had a major impact in the past year on global trade, and China's actions will also do that. From China's point of view, this deal is a positive sign. It's a stabilization of diplomatic ties that were particularly tense, but China's not unaware that such tensions could appear and could escalate again. In 2018, when Trump started the trade war, China was very unprepared. In 2025, when Trump round two kicked off in April, China was much better prepared. But from Xi Jinping's point of view, China could be even more prepared. And that means ensuring that it has that stranglehold of the rare earth industry, but also where the US particularly had leverage over China was on the semiconductor sector. So, in particularly design, that's where the US leads through companies like NVIDIA, but also through US allies like ASML in the Netherlands, which produces the only lithography machines that produces advanced semiconductor chips. So that is a vulnerability for China. So we're likely to see significantly more investment in semiconductor chips, trying to build those domestic capabilities. We assess it's likely to be difficult. I mean, we've definitely recorded some breakthroughs that Huawei has. There's also, espionage that goes on in order to try and gain top tech, or hiring Chinese workers who had worked for US tech companies in order to expand its capabilities. But with the speed of semiconductor chip development, it's really hard to just keep up, never mind reach that level or overtake the US. So this is going to be a main point of vulnerability, but China's going to continue that sort of mission of what Xi Jinping calls new productive forces, more green technologies, leading in robotics, AI, drones, the so-called new technologies and electric vehicles. And in terms of, reliance, in terms of vulnerability to the next round of trade conflict, which might be next year, might be the year after, China is going to seek to diversify its trade. And you can see by this graphic, there's already been a shift in the level of reliance on North American trade, but China's also significantly increasing trade with the rest of the world. So this year, a few months ago, China announced tariff-free policy for all exports from Africa. During the recent ASEAN summit, China reached a 3.0 updated trade agreement with ASEAN nations to have more tariff-free trade. And China would also like in 2026, most probably, to try and stabilize ties with the EU. There's definitely been tensions there with EV tariffs and other measures, but reducing reliance on the US will be a key objective. Where that may create some problems for China is that can provoke some pushback, especially amid allegations of overcapacity or dumping. So China will also be wary of the potential for retaliatory tariffs, and China would ideally seek to avoid sort of trade tensions with other powers, but whether they can achieve that or not is somewhat uncertain. And finally, I'd say the sort of big sort of structural shift that a lot of maybe predominantly Western economic analysts talk about is China's shift from production to consumption. China's phenomenal economic growth over recent decades has been largely driven by its exports, becoming the world's factory. But with increased trade tensions and the push towards self-sufficiency, someone needs to be buying these goods. If they're producing so much and the world is going to push back against some of China's trade measures, Chinese consumers need to spend a bit more. So that is one of the objectives of the government, to sort of stimulate consumer spending. One issue they will face, though, is it's consumer confidence. It's hard to change consumer behavior through government policy. China has a demographics issue, and it's been trying to take measures in order to boost births, but its ability to give families, young parents enough financial support to have more children hasn't exactly worked so well. So they will probably try more policies to this effect. But ultimately, China's economy is still so heavily reliant on exports. People still save so much money because there's a lack of a welfare state in China, particularly for healthcare. So people save money in case for a rainy day. So China is still going to be quite reliant on export growth, but we are going to see a shift more towards policy promoting consumption. And I think that will be a component of the 15th five-year plan in March. And I'll leave it there and let Athor talk through the US side.
Thank you, Jonah. And so when looking at the domestic response and impacts in the US from the trade deal, our assessment is that, in the short term, this trade framework will decrease compliance and supply chain disruption risks for US consumer goods and manufacturing sectors, as well as perhaps, more critically in technology firms and other sectors such as automotive, defense, or electronics that are more reliant on rare earth elements and magnets and kind of all these reserves that China has. Nevertheless, thinking about kind of the immediate positive effects, we assess that despite the agreement, heightened legislative scrutiny over dealings with China will continue to be a bipartisan issue within the US Congress. And this kind of makes the newfound framework susceptible to congressional committee probes. Just as an example of this, yesterday, a House Committee on China Relations published a 50-page report, a bipartisan report, stating that China is responsible for manipulating global critical mineral prices and concludes that China has used its control over prices as an economic weapon, quote unquote, to expand its manufacturing sector and geopolitical influence. And so while we assess that these kinds of reports are unlikely to drive a breakdown in US-China relations, it underscores kind of the domestic pressures that the Trump administration faces to reduce its dependence on China in the longer term. A figure that I found kind of interesting in considering this issue and the agreement was that the Yale Budget Lab states that the average effective tariff rate on Chinese goods has risen by 20.2% this year compared to an average of 17.3% for the rest of the world. So we can see there that there's not much of a difference. And so this reality effectively kind of removes incentives for firms in the short term to relocate outside of China or to relocate to closer neighbors like India, for example, that now faces 50% tariffs. So it kind of undermines the administration's aims within its tariff agenda, what they initially wanted to achieve. And this has kind of generated a public sentiment, but also a government sentiment that were kind of in the previous status quo. The caveat here that I think is important to point out is that countries that were able to secure deals, here I'm thinking about Japan, South Korea, Cambodia, Malaysia, where some of these businesses would consider relocating, are no longer as competitive since their tariff rates are not that much lower to China's. Plus they face kind of heightened scrutiny from the US over transshipment issues, for example. And that is likely to be sustained throughout the year that this trade suspension is going over. There is a sentiment within the US that the meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping did not advance US policy objectives and interests overall, and weakened the US leverage that it had over China in the longer term. And so kind of this is underscored by the domestic situation currently, where there's reports emerging that kind of due to tariff pressures, US manufacturing continues to contract. So it is the 8th month in a row that this is contracting. And, that has been kind of a significant point within the popularity of the Trump administration domestically. And I think, given the US-China trade timeline that we have observed since the second term of the Trump administration, this trade framework seems equally as fragile as previous iterations, since it doesn't really address kind of the root causes of the friction. It appears that, you know, if the more serious conversations will follow the agreement rather than precede it. And, you know, this is likely a tool within the Trump administration to ease investor confidence and decrease tensions with China, rather than really create a framework for competition with China. You know, and I think a key here that we have observed as kind of signaling who the winner of this deal, if we can call it that, is, you know, that within 1 year that the truce is supposedly over, so November 2026, that will be right at the doorstep of the US midterm elections. So here, you know, China gains a significant leverage over the Trump administration, you know, because people domestically will be demanding results from this agreement or progress within the framework. And, you know, this gives enough time potentially for China to comprehensively arrange export controls on rare earth elements, since, you know, the recent investments that the US has made on critical minerals with other countries in the region, for example, will not have produced their gains quite yet. And so to this end, the Trump administration will continue to concentrate its efforts to seek alternative partners in the region to strengthen supply chains in critical minerals, and, you know, especially, you know, semiconductors, in terms of extraction and processing. We already see that happening with partnerships with Japan, Australia, and Uzbekistan, as well as also seeing it in the recent changes in industrial policy within the US related to kind of the Commerce Department announcing plans to take equity stakes from different firms. So this includes, you know, Lithium America, Vulcan Elements, Re-Elements Technologies, and multiple firms within the US to kind of concentrate efforts to, you know, bring the supply chain of critical minerals within the US and reduce that reliance on China. And with that, if we can go to the next slide. So thank you. So basically, the question on everyone's mind, I'm sure, is what are the pressure points on both sides for a re-escalation of trade tensions between the US and China and a potential kind of breakdown of this deal in the coming year, in the coming months. So our overall assessment is that the US-China relationship will remain fragile in the coming months as both sides kind of attempt to reduce the reliance on one another. And with that in mind, we wanted to kind of outline what the triggers, warnings, and indicators would be for this breakdown. So I'll be covering the US perspective. Here we see kind of the first point being claims of non-compliance and rare earth export controls reimposed. So this refers to kind of claims stemming from the administration or Congress alluding to China potentially failing to meet the conditions of the trade framework, especially when it comes to, you know, rare earth elements. The second would be kind of upticks in fentanyl deaths. So this involves kind of the release of data or reports from government officials that there has been an increase in fentanyl deaths in the coming months. And although this isn't necessarily a policy priority within this framework, given that neither country has established a formal framework to address it before signing the deal, you know, but it may result in a snapping back of the 20% tariffs that were halved in November 10th. The third TWI would be kind of an increased trade alignment with China from allies in Latin America and Asia and the EU, as well as within the USMCA trade partnership. So that includes Canada and Mexico. So individually, this trend would likely harm the country making the deal with China rather than China itself. So here I'm thinking of the current US-Canada trade dynamic where, you know, Canada is more susceptible towards aligning with China than the other way around. However, if this becomes kind of part of a larger trend in terms of, you know, the terms of trade will possibly be revisited, then second to last would be the breakdown in TikTok deal negotiations. So earlier in November, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced that China had approved the transfer agreement for TikTok ownership with the expectation for the deal to move forward in the coming weeks and months. The fluidity of the timeline is likely an indication of both countries kind of waiting on the trends emerging from this deal, that I mentioned previously, as kind of leverage for future negotiations in the coming months to revisit the framework. And then finally, another GWI would be kind of China failing to meet soybean commitments. So soybean purchases are something that is very politically sensitive within the United States currently, because we are amid kind of a process to give farmer aid to farmer relief packages that have not been yet approved by Congress or the administration, as well as kind of the context of the US giving the $20 billion currency swap deal with Argentina, and China kind of increasing their imports of Argentine soybeans. And so this can kind of trigger a reevaluation of the deal as well. And with that, I'll let Jonah cover China side.
Thanks, Athul. Yeah, just on that, the soybean import commitments, they are going to be pretty high. I mean, it was around 12 million tons by the end of the year, 25 million from next year, and China has already sought to diversify its purchases from Brazil and other countries. So it'll be interesting to see how that one develops, particularly as they didn't meet the soybean import requirements in the first phase one trade deal in Trump's first term. There was COVID. But anyway, on China, I think key issues that may derail the trade agreement from Beijing's perspective, starting with that would be further US restrictions on semiconductor supply chain exports. These have been introduced at a pretty regular frequency since 2022, when the Biden administration used this as a key point of preventing China's technological dominance, or as part of technological competition. And as we've talked about earlier in this webinar, despite the trade deal reducing immediate tensions, strategic competition still persists. So the US is still interested in winning the AI race, still outperforming China in various technologies. So there will be significant pressure on the US to potentially impose these restrictions. But from China's point of view, that would be a sort of a break of the trust of the agreement, and could easily provoke retaliatory measures in rare earth. So be interesting to see US political dynamics on that. But China's definitely ready to retaliate if the US imposes such restrictions. Yeah, Athul mentioned US scrutiny on transshipments. It's a really good point, because definitely a lot of Chinese companies going back several years now have tried to avert US tariffs by basically setting up a factory in another country. And this is pretty convenient in other ways, because actually China's average incomes have increased significantly over recent years. So there is an economic incentive to set up in Vietnam or other Southeast Asian countries. What is interesting, I've noticed from some of the trade agreements that the US has made this year, is a lot of them, including with the UK, including with Vietnam, has been issues about not just the relationship on a bilateral level, but also concerning other countries. And particularly with Vietnam, part of reciprocal tariffs, there were tariffs imposed on transshipments. So the US is trying to close down on this loophole. Obviously not in China's interest, which China's saying it's allowed to outsource its manufacturing, like the US has been doing for many decades. Though more scrutiny on this, more stricter measures that prevent China from doing this would definitely re-escalate tensions. More Chinese companies added to the US entity list. Now, this entity list means that companies on this list were if a company wanted to sell to those companies, or if you wanted to sell a good to a company on an entity list, you would need a license of certain technologies. So it makes it operating in the US and abroad really difficult if you're on this entity list. And major Chinese tech companies like Huawei have gone on that entity list. So this is ostensibly for national security, what the US would say. So were more companies to be added to this, I think China would see this as make the business environment in the US becoming more difficult for Chinese firms, and what it would see as discriminatory action. So China's sort of investigations, antitrust, anti-monopoly investigations against US firms were often at least portrayed or seen as in retaliation to entity list additions. So any more additions to the entity list would potentially prompt retaliatory action. Taiwan, yeah, hard not to mention Taiwan in a China webinar, even when we're talking about trade, but this does remain, despite all the trade tensions, the number one area of friction between the two great powers. China is hoping that the US does not massively be involved in the Taiwan issue. This is not to say that an invasion or military action is imminent. That's not our assessment. But what any major moves towards a pro-independence stance from the Taiwanese government, prompted by more arms sales, would provoke tensions with China. And there is a real direct relationship between the military, the political, and the economic in this bilateral relationship. For example, after the former US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in 2022, China suspended military-to-military dialogue, suspended climate change cooperation, and the economic cooperation too. So an escalation in Taiwan, around Taiwan, be it US started, China started, something like that could prompt the whole bilateral relationship as a whole to become less stable than it was, and then leading to a more fractious economic environment where abiding by this trade deal may be more politically difficult. And finally, an exogenous event, provocations with Japan or South Korea. So, as you know, Japan and South Korea are close allies of the US. But what interesting development has been the new Prime Minister of Japan, Sanai Takaichi, who's long been a more hawkish personality on China policy. Recently, there was a lot of diplomatic dispute because she met with a senior advisor to the Taiwanese president. She also indicated potential Japanese involvement in a Taiwan contingency. China's responded very poorly to this. So there's tensions in that relationship, while also there's consistent competition between China and South Korea and the LOC. So with these sort of other areas of geopolitical tensions, there could be a derailing of the bilateral relationship. If the US becomes too partisan in such issues, China could seek retaliatory measures against the US. So I'd say that those are the 5 main areas of where of incidents or trends that could derail the trade agreement.
Many thanks to you both. So now we have Q&A, so please do leave your questions, and I will get that to the panelists. But I have a couple of questions to start off with. First of all, the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, has made rulings on in regards to President Donald Trump's tariff policies. How does this come into play vis-a-vis its position towards China and its trade relationship with China?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question. So essentially what the Supreme Court of the United States is looking at is the 10% reciprocal tariff rate imposed on China as part of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And therefore, this will be kind of the rate that is impacted by the ruling. The other 10% rate related to fentanyl trafficking is under another framework, more of a national security framework within the United States, so that would not be as impacted. However, so far our assessment is that if the Supreme Court kind of strikes down on tariffs, and I say this because the administration is currently facing a lot of pushback from the conservative justices, the tariff will likely be reimposed using an alternative law for implementation. So, given that this is a bipartisan issue, it doesn't necessarily mean that tariffs on China will be completely rolled back. It'll just be reassessed and reimposed in a different form. This isn't, this is all to say kind of that I don't see a Supreme Court ruling as significantly impacting the outcomes of this deal necessarily in the coming months, especially as the conclusion is not set to kind of come until later next year.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. A different element that China doesn't really have to deal with themselves. So that's the interesting contrast. And then a question about particularly about Xi and Trump. Obviously, following the meeting in Seoul, it was indicated that Trump may visit Xi in China. I think it was April. I might be wrong there, in 2026. Do we think this is likely? What can we expect in the run up to that? And will anything significant potentially come out of them meeting again? I'll pass over to Jonah first, but then so please do come in with anything you might have to add.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the Chinese perspective. State visits are a big deal. The show diplomacy signals are really important in China. In Trump's last state visit to China was in 2017. He was the first foreign leader, head of state to have dinner in the Forbidden City. And there was a great deal of events and a lot of attention paid to the visit. So I think China's going to prepare heavily for that, and generally, based on precedent, ahead of these sort of meetings or state visits, there is a calming of tensions. There's every minutia of details of this visit would have to be planned, agreed upon, protocols, and ideally from both sides, if a further agreement or things could come out of this rather than just a bit of pomp and cheer, that would be a success. So on an optimistic side, I would say that there will probably be a more focus on, at least on that higher level ahead of the meeting, about how do we make this visit a success, how do we make it productive rather than dealing with the other areas of friction. But I'm not sure if Athul, you agree from the American side.
Yeah, certainly. I think, as we've come to learn in the 11 months of the Trump administration, these meetings that are planned very far in advance tend to usually be subject to change a little bit. Nevertheless, under the assumption that the meeting does take place, it will likely act as a benchmark for progress from the U.S. perspective in China meeting soybean purchase commitments, export controls on high-tech and rare earth minerals, in the fentanyl trafficking question. And so, it is likely that if the administration perceives that little progress has been made within the framework that they've created, there might be kind of the same environment of tit for tat measures that we saw ahead of the conversations in June and in October. And so, this might influence outcomes. By measures, I mean, implementing tariff rates again or snapping back the probes on different Chinese firms. And so, given the timeline, this may also be an opportunity for the Trump administration to extend the trade measure suspension by a couple more months to remove the overlap with the U.S. midterm elections. I think this would be something that the administration would benefit from and would look to kind of discuss in this high-level meeting in China.
Thank you very much, both of you. And one question from the audience, this one for you as well. So you mentioned the midterms already, and then how that may align. Can we expect anything from the US government in that period, particularly with regard to China trade policy?
Yeah, certainly. I can tackle that. I think so far from the administration, the name of the game has been critical minerals. And I think, within this conversation, the US will continue to attempt to lower its reliance on China for a lot of these supply chains. So that can look like increasing investments in Australia to kind of extract gallium and different elements that are used in semiconductors, or look internally towards shifts in changes in industrial policy to kind of take equity stakes and promote this. There is a critical mineral czar in the United States, and so kind of implementing these measures to lower the reliance. I think also, especially in the context that we have now with the ending of the government shutdown and kind of what seems to be a slowing down of the tariff conversation within the United States, it's more likely that the Trump administration will look more inwards, look at the domestic environment a bit more. There's the big affordability question that is part of a lot of kind of polls, both from Republicans and Democrats. And so kind of looking more internally at housing practices and different kind of socioeconomic health impacts. So I think, once, if those TWIs that we mentioned before are not hit, I think the US ahead of the midterm election will kind of lay off being perceived as kind of the loser in this agreement and kind of staying within the structure to kind of not distract with the global tariff agenda, which we've seen hasn't had the intended outcomes so far that the administration set out at the beginning of the year.
That's interesting. And another thing that, again, China doesn't really have to contend with. So it'll be interesting as those elections approach. And then I have one final question before we go. And I guess that's the original briefing question. In your opinion, both of you, is this a truce or a rapprochement, or maybe start of a maybe new, different but stable trading relationship? In your assessment, at least.
Can go first. It's one interesting thing that's come out in terms of the rhetoric from both sides is the use of the term G2, which Trump personally used, and then Secretary of War Pete Hegseth also used, which is a term that China proposed in 2013 or so, 2014, to former US President Barack Obama's idea. We're the two big powers, we're going to help shape the world together from a more collaborative point of view. But the Chinese outreach on this point was rebuffed. The US is still top dog. It still wanted to be the leader of the so-called rules-based international order. But there does seem to be a shift. I mean, the fact that they're using this term, not necessarily with the context of that history, but the idea that there's a begrudging respect that China is going to play a major role in the world. But I guess G2 now will have a different implication to what it meant then, in terms of G2 not being a let's hold hands and plan the world together, but more we realize we're the two biggest economies and militaries. We know we're in competition, but let's try and manage our competition and stop it veering into conflict. So if there is a more mature approach to the relationship and a focus on reducing destabilizing policies, such as provocations around each other's core interests, be it espionage in the US, or the export of fentanyl precursors, or from the Chinese side, provocations around Taiwan, then you could have optimistically a more stable form of competitive relationship. So I would refrain from using the word rapprochement, but I would say maybe there was a truce. We have identified already that things could break down, but hopefully this could be a framework for a more stable relationship going forward.
I completely agree with you, Jonah. I think also, it was very evident that both the US and China could hit each other where it hurts throughout these past couple of months. And so I think, it is in the best interest of both the US and China to kind of continue with this truce and work in the background towards reducing this reliance and forming more alliances with partners in the region. And so I completely agree with your assessment on that.
Thank you both. And one quick question we came in late. What factors are in the mix potentially with this relationship that we haven't necessarily touched on so far that you would maybe like to highlight, maybe one each before we go?
Sure. I mean, I would say I'd say domestic. I think, I mean, this is very true for America as well, I'm sure, but in terms of domestic policy, I think being a key thing. But I guess with the US, we've got a democratic system and a very different situation. But in China, there's also accountability, party legitimacy, um, and I think that what you do have, I guess, in terms of the big political event is the Party Congress in 2027, which is once every 5 years, which potentially will pave the way for a fourth term for Xi Jinping. There is domestic pressure, on the one hand, to be quite nationalistic, to defend China's interests, not to overly concede. So there's that pressure, but also there's the economic pressures domestically, such as youth unemployment, such as demographic issues that may drive economic policy, and achieving those domestic economic and political goals will probably take predominance over ensuring the relationship is stable with the US. So that could be a key factor in China's policy making.
Yeah, to add on to that from the US perspective, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think we can't underestimate the importance of the US midterm elections and how the US goes into campaign mode from now on. And so that is going to be a factor that really influences this analysis, as well as, other huge negotiations that we have coming up in the next year. So now I'm thinking the US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement. That is something that the US will be focusing on in the coming months, and whatever results of that and whatever the conversations are around China and Canada and Mexico will also be kind of huge factors in whether or not kind of this framework continues and our assessment holds.
Yeah, that's a very good point. US seems to be negotiating new trade deals with every country at the same time, which of course I'm sure will be a stretch. Well, thank you all. Thank you to the audience for joining. Particular thanks to Jonah and Thor for sharing their thoughts. Really fascinating, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of ups and downs in this story in this year. So we may be back here. But in the meantime, if anyone has any further questions or anything query, please do email us here, and we will of course be following this in our reporting, future webinars potentially, and elsewhere. And take care in the meantime. And again, thank you for joining.
Thank you all.
Thank you.